Thank you very much for that kind welcome, Professor Kramer. I'm very grateful to the AIA for inviting me back to come and do another lecture tour in the States. It's always a great pleasure to come back to the side of the pond and to come somewhere new indeed, because I've not been to this particular corner of the States before. So thank you to the West Illinois branch for inviting me to come here to address you this evening. Could we turn the lights on, please? Arranged. I also have some other thanks to give, and that is to my own institution, the University of Leicester, for kindly allowing me to skive off a week early from our term, which only finished last Friday, to come and play inside the pond while my colleagues are marking term papers. Anyway, for those of you who may be interested, we'll have some literature here which talks about our various courses, and you may actually have heard of us as an outfit because we are the friendly people who brought you the king under the car park. Recently, King Richard III was excavated by my colleagues, and if you're interested in learning more about him, we have an online MOOC which is freely accessible for you to explore the wonders of our dead sub-car park monarch. But anyway, let's come on to the thing that I've come to talk about here tonight, which is my own aspects of my own research. Excuse me. Because for a very long time I've been interested in the archaeology of Rome in the East. So call this topic kind of a shameless come on really to get people to come. Blood in the dust and death in the dark, combat chemical warfare, Roman Dura-Europos. What we're talking about here this evening is more or less a cold case CSI kind of thing. That a lot of what we do as archaeologists dealing with the mute remains from the past is effectively the same as the kind of stuff you see on CSI. Particularly where you have no witnesses and no witness statements. You're just relying on physical traces at the scene of the crime. Okay? And we have a very good analogy of this here at Dura-Europos, this site in eastern Syria, because what we're going to be showing you is the archaeology of a series of events which took place probably over a period of no more than a few minutes, will be the main focus of this lecture, for which there is no written account. And indeed, this is in the midst of a major siege which results in the destruction of an entire city and its extinction, which is effectively unknown to history. This is entirely a story which is told very nearly entirely. In this particular area, where the big green stripe there is the Euphrates Valley. Now, over the last few millions of years, the great Euphrates River, heading down from Turkey all the way down to what we call the Persian Gulf today, has meandered backwards and forwards, cutting a wide channel through what is a great gypsum-topped limestone plateau here. We often talk about this as desert. It is not actually desert in this area. It's you get that much rain a year, so it's actually technically steppe. So what's happened here is the river has cut this very broad channel, which as you can see in the springtime is immensely fertile. This is very much like the Egyptian, the Valley of the Nile. Now, this city, we know as a result of the excavations, in antiquity had alternative names. It was known either as Dura, which in the local Semitic dialect at the time means stronghold, but this was actually, as we'll see, a city which regarded itself as a Greek community primarily, or Druze regarded themselves as Greeks, and they called their city Europos. And because both these names were current, it's now commonly known as the compound Dura-Europos. That's entirely modern. It was never known as that double name in antiquity, one or the other. I spent much of my career working on the archaeology of Dura-Europos. In recent times, until my fieldwork, fortunately for me, I finished my fieldwork the year before the Syrian civil war broke out, but actually partly on the site in recent years. But most of what I've done over the last 30 years on Dura has been archival-based research, which is another thing I kind of want to put onto your radar today, because we archaeologists love to go and dig new holes. I had a brilliant time doing this. I'll explain more about what I'm doing here towards the end of the presentation. But over the years, I've had really just as much fun in the Excavation archive at Yale University Art Gallery, looking through all the stuff that was found in the 1920s and 30s, much of it was never published properly, and finding out all sorts of amazing things an early generation of scholars discovered, but partly because of the intervention of World War II, and they were scattered on military service and never got back to this. A lot of that stuff has remained buried in the archive. In a way, the story I'm going to tell you tonight is kind of a doubly buried case. What we're looking at is something that was discovered in 1933-4, and there's one of the original drawings of what I'm going to be talking about up there. And the story was kind of half understood, I think, at the time. Then all this stuff was effectively shoved in those filing cabinet drawers until I started to go back through it again in recent times and started pondering once more what actually had been found and what did it mean. Unfortunately, since 2011, it's become all too easy to imagine what the horror of the siege of Dura was like, because Syria has, as you know, been plunged into one of the most appalling wars that certainly I witnessed in my lifetime, which almost incredibly in the world has seen the revival of siege warfare. A number of Syrian cities are being besieged, even as we speak. And then another thing which has resonated rather horribly for me with my own research of the last few years, we've had the use of chemical weapons in the conflict in Syria as well. So this story, this renewed war, has kicked back directly into the Dura-Europos project. Here's our excavation house at Dura, which was very well appointed, which, as you can see, has been utterly trashed by looters, and the site now is being apparently systematically quarried for antiquities to sell, as so many of Syria's sites are. So Syria currently is a multiple tragedy. There's the appalling loss of life, displacement of millions of people, but these people are also being robbed of their own heritage by systematic plundering of archaeological sites. There are those who have argued that what we're witnessing in Syria is really a direct consequence of the map of the Middle East, which was created not least by the British and the French in the aftermath of World War I, the destruction of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, the carving up of the Middle East, which has led to all sorts of problems, of course, ever since. And this photograph actually shows the day Dura-Europos was identified. It was actually discovered by Indian soldiers under the British Empire who were in, well, that time's called Mesopotamia. It was about to be known as Iraq and Syria. And these guys were pursuing Arab insurgents. Does this sound familiar? This photograph was taken a few weeks before the modern border between Syria and Iraq was actually enacted on the ground through the agreement of the British and French colonising powers. And this area found itself immediately thereafter now part of the French mandate. So these troops were withdrawn, having discovered the site and discovered its name. And during the 1920s and 30s, the site here was excavated on a massive scale. This always reminds me of the Indiana Jones Well of Souls excavation. You've all seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, haven't you? And indeed, the archaeologists at the time, as you may see in some of the photos later, looked very much like Indiana Jones. This site produced some astonishing treasures, some of which I'll be showing you. So much so it became known in the 20s and 30s as the Pompeii of the East. Fantastic wall paintings, buildings, temples, all sorts of things were discovered here. My main purpose, of course, is to talk about the military antiquities here today, and many of these were found and explored by a leading member of the Franco-American team who excavated here between 1928 and 1937. And that area is on the right, a serving French officer and also a French aristocrat, Monsieur le Comte Robert Dumesnil du Buisson. I must say that. And he excavated quite a lot of traces of the siege which had destroyed the city. One of which, particular one we're going to focus on, is this mine at Tower 19 here, where you can see even the timber pit prop still existed, surviving from the mid-3rd century AD. And my own involvement, as I said, started off as being archival, looking at Yale University Art Gallery's records of all of these digs to find out what had been found. But I was very lucky to get involved with the new Franco-Syrian project, which had been going since the 1980s. Of course, forcibly terminated in 2011 because of the Civil War, under the leadership of another Frenchman, Pierre Lariche, my colleague, who very kindly allowed me to play in the Roman military base in the northern part of the site. He helped me to arrange with the Syrians to go out there for a period of years with my small team, a very small team at times, you can see here. I did actually sometimes have some larger people with me as well to do geophysical survey. and conducted some very limited excavations, some of which added to the story of the siege. You see one of the points of the siege works behind. I'll come back to that in a minute. A little background to why this city is here. Dura, as we commonly call it for short, was established as a Hellenistic garrison shortly after Alexander's death, when this area falls to the Seleucid dynasty, becomes the Seleucid Empire, and they established this military garrison, Florion, at this highly defensible site, which is halfway between the twin capitals of Seleucia on the Tigris and Antioch on the Orontes, on the Mediterranean. And gradually a little village and then a town grows up around this Hellenistic fortification and garrison, and it's growing into a Greek city at the time when much of the Seleucid Empire is gobbled up from the east by the rising power of the Parthian Empire, one of the most fascinating, least understood empires of antiquity, which, as you can see, came to conquer, or to control basically modern Iran and Iraq, roughly speaking, plus some other bits and bobs. So the red dot there shows where Dura was, a western province of the Parthian world. So in that sense, it's a, you might call it, it has been called a Parthian city. It's a Greek city within the Parthian Empire and the Parthian law. It continues to think of itself as a Greek community. And this is what the city looks like, pretty much, by the later 1st century AD, under Parthian suzerainty. It's a medium-sized town on the middle Euphrates, and this is where actually there is a good parallel with Pompeii, because as many of you will doubtless know, Pompeii wasn't an important place. It was a medium-sized, not very significant town. The reason it's significant for us is because it happened to have a volcano fall on it, and we've been able to dig it up and find remarkable preservation. Dura was rather similar. It wasn't a particularly important place. We just happened to know an awful lot about it because of the chances of survival and of archaeological research. This is a slide I always like to show to give a bit of an idea of the scale of the imperial systems we're dealing with here. Because as Dura was falling under Parthian power, so of course the Romans were moving into the Middle East as well. And I'm primarily a Roman military archaeologist, and a lot of my fellow Roman military archaeologists get ever so excited about things like our Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain. And as I often like to point out to them, if I can kind of paraphrase Crocodile Dundee at this point, that's not a frontier, that's a frontier. It's the Roman Empire, the Parthian Empire. That was one of the most important frontiers in the Roman world, colossal, and it actually becomes more important during the course of our story here. So that's where Dura was, inside the Parthian Empire, but the Romans had other ideas because, especially by the 2nd century AD, you have a series of emperors who are trying to conquer at least the western half of Parthia. That's Mesopotamia, Babylonia, the area we now call Iraq. And one of the first Roman emperors to succeed in briefly conquering all that area was the best of emperors, Trajan, who was memorably described to me by Professor John Mann as a homicidal megalomaniac. So he also committed genocide in what's now Romania as well. But yeah, he was a good emperor, it's fine, don't worry about it. And then that fails, basically, because there was in Mesopotamia a major insurrection or insurgency, and the Romans were forced to withdraw. So again, does this sound familiar? And then the Romans go back in again in the 160s under Lucius Verus and Marcus Aurelius, and they get down to the Baghdad area again, and they're forced to withdraw once more. So the Romans had great fun invading Mesopotamia and taking the cities around the area of Baghdad, looting them and going home again because they can't hold them. However, at least in the 160s, they do finally manage to annex Dura. It now becomes a Roman-controlled city, and this is where it moves to the period that I've been studying. A Roman military garrison is established in what becomes literally the military quarter. Each 1/4 of the area of the city is taken over as a military base. Why do the Romans do this? Because they want a forward operating base for more aggressions against the Parthian Empire, which they're using as a military punchback through much of the 2nd century AD and into the 3rd. So here's Septimius Severus, who is responsible for beefing up the military base at Dura. From his arch in Rome there is a relief representing the attack on Ctesiphon or Seleucia on the Tigris, one or the other. And a Parthian horse archer, the kind of guys who were fighting him, finding more and more difficult to contain the Romans. Then something disastrous for the Romans happens because, as I said, they repeatedly invaded Iraq and have managed to get in there but not hold it, and then have to withdraw again with lots of booty. What they were trying to do was to conquer the Parthian Empire. All they actually succeeded in doing was weakening it and triggering a revolution, which leads to the rise of a major new empire. The Arsacid Parthian dynasty is overthrown, and it's replaced by this much more dangerous for the Romans Sassanian dynasty, or Sassanid dynasty, the Sassanian Empire. The Romans call these guys Persians. They are based in the province of Fars, which we call Persis. So in that sense you could call them Persians. They call themselves Iranians. That was their term for themselves. And this particular new dynasty, under the first king Ardashir here, and then their second king, Shapur I the Great, beat the living daylights out of the Romans in the Middle East repeatedly. And this is a fantastic Sassanian propaganda relief from Fars, which shows the great king triumphing over no less than 3 Roman emperors. And he's claiming here to have killed one. He's got Gordian III, that we presume is the figure down here, trampled under his horse. He's got this emperor here on his bended knees, which has to be Philip the Arab, who was basically, he was cornered with his army and had to sue for peace to be able to go home. And over here, you've got the unluckiest of all Roman emperors, Valerian, who's the only Roman emperor ever to be taken alive by a foreign enemy. And allegedly, he was used as a footstool by the King of Kings, and again, according to one tradition anyway, when he died, his body was stuffed and kept in the Imperial court. So, this was the nadir of Roman fortunes in the East. So Shapur was the sort of the terrible bane of the Romans. Now, our story, the events I'm going to recount, happened kind of in the middle of the events conflated into this relief, because this represents events spanning the late 230s through to about 260 when Valerian was captured. But what happened at Dura was it goes very quickly from being a forward attack base to suddenly being the first line of defence, because now the Sassanians are very much coming back at the Romans big time, trying to get revenge for all these invasions of Iraq. And allegedly, maybe they were trying to conquer Syria. What the Sassanians were trying to do, we don't know. They certainly repeatedly attacked Syria, sacked many cities. And there are some rather spine-chilling graffiti from Dura, or Dipinto rather, which says, the Persians descended upon us. This is to be dated about 8239, a major attack on the city, we didn't get in. And maybe dated around this period is this remarkable graffito, which is about this big, which shows a charging armoured knight. The Sassanians, like the Parthians before them, had super heavy cavalry, lance-armed, which very much are the forerunners of medieval knights. So they went into jousting as well. So this is where this kind of tradition, we think was medieval European, probably starts. Now the Romans realise they are in big, big trouble here, and they are determined to hold Dura. So what you see there is the inside of the old Greek city wall. The vulnerable side of the city is a long straight wall that faces flat out onto the flat plateau. So what they did was they built a massive reinforcing rampart behind the wall here, largely re-excavated away in the 20s and 30s, but you can still see the foot of it, and that projects the line of it here. An enormous embankment. Here it is in cross-section, one of the towers. So you've got this great dump rampart behind, and you've got mud brick glacis on the front. The idea is this is to strengthen the walls against undermining or against battering rams. They are expecting a full-on siege. And this is built around about the year 254 from coin evidence. And you can see the glacis incident goes all the way around the front of the towers. This is seriously strengthening the city in anticipation of a major siege. What it also does, incidentally, is to encase lots of the buildings. All the buildings along Wall Street were encased in mud brick and in earth. And I mentioned it rains at Dura, and it can become horrendously soggy underfoot, liquid mud. But you'll notice these steep slopes here. What actually happened was that from AD 254 onwards, right the way down until the excavations in the 1930s, the winter rains would just run off the surface of this. So this area in here was bone dry, like Egypt, all the way through those centuries, with fantastic preservation of artefacts remains. And some of you may know about things like the great painted synagogue that was found at Dura-Europos, one of its most famous remains. There's also a Christian chapel, about the earliest known Christian chapel, which has a baptistry arrangement in it and so forth, and wall paintings of Christ walking on the water, and the Good Shepherd, and so forth. These were all found along Wall Street, entombed in this great rampart. Now, my main interest has been what we call portable material culture, stuff you pick up, use and carry, and it included, again, remarkable things you normally only would expect to see in Egypt, like textiles, the child's boots you see up there, lots of, some anyway, I should exaggerate this, but some hundreds of papyrus documents, including one or two early Christian pieces, and the stuff which makes my heart sing, weaponry, wooden shields. Normally you only find the metal bits if you're lucky in Europe. Here we've got complete wooden shields. I'll show you one example of this non. So fantastic preservation. Lucky for us, but of course this was a catastrophe for the city. And the Roman preparation, sadly for them, were not overcautious or in vain. A few years ago, my French colleagues identified the Sassanian siege camp. And as you can see, that's its outline. The Sassanian siege camp is twice the size of the city. They were very, very serious about taking the city. And this corresponds with what had been clear earlier on, colossal, very elaborate siege works undertaken as well. And from in and around the city, lots and lots of evidence of the fighting that ensued, which is dated to probably the year 256 plus or minus months, which is incredibly tight dating in archaeological terms. And this included things like catapult projectiles. The thing at the top there is about that long, and this is an incendiary projectile. It has a cage of iron bars. You can put a wad of tissue, of fabric in there, soak it in crude oil, or maybe not in oil, certainly crude oil, set fire to it, and you can shoot it into siege engines or shoot it into roofs of buildings and set things on fire. And these are artillery stones, and this was part of a dump of 800 kilos of artillery stones in one particular part of the city, which my French colleagues excavated recently. So a little indication of the intensity of the fighting, but we can also tell you a lot about the detail of how the siege was fought. Very likely, one of the first things you do in an ancient siege is you have a go at the gates. That they're in some ways maybe the weakest points to get in, so especially if you can take the defenders by surprise or rush the gates. It's very likely the Sassanians had a go at the river gate, but that's long since been washed away by the Euphrates, so we can't say anything about that really. We can say a lot about their major assault, which is straight across the plain from their siege camp onto the long straight wall facing out across the steppe. And there are several loci here where we have good archaeology of what the Sassanians did to try to break in. They started with a siege ramp down at the southern end of the city wall. They certainly had a go, unsurprisingly, at the main Palmyrene gate. And the main thing I'm going to talk about is another quite complex siege operation at Tower 19, trying to break through the wall there. So we'll start at the southern end briefly, with the siege ramp. Now, this is the kind of thing which is described in antiquity, and a number of examples are known around the world. There's a fantastic one in Masada in Israel still surviving. But this is one of the most complex examples that have ever been found. So the red line shows the line of the siege ramp as it is today. It's quite hard to see it because of all the mounds of earth from the excavations of the 1930s. But this is made of brick, and on the top of it you can see there's this little survey marker, which helps you see where we're looking at the same point from different angles. Here's the inside of the city walls, which have been encased in the rampart. You can see there are also mines here as well, literally undermining, which I'll explain in a minute. And this is the only place, as far as I know, in the world where you could still see Hellenistic battlements on top of the walls, which have been preserved here too. So Pierre Lariche was very interested as somebody interested in Hellenistic defences, fascinated also by the siege remains, which are so rich and remarkably well preserved, because they were just left there, they were never damaged or removed. He's done further work following up on Dumesnil's excavations, which he added some refinements, but not really fundamentally altered what Dumesnil discovered in the 1930s, which is represented in this rather lovely series of drawings I found in the Yale archive, which I know was published at the time. So what we can see is happening here, what the Sassanians are trying to do is to send troops over the top of the wall. So what you do is you build a ramp, and you have a siege machine on it on wheels. We don't know the exact design of this because that wasn't recovered. But the idea is you can then have a bridge or something which drops onto the wall, and you go over the top. A bit like the Battle of Helm's Deep, if any of you have seen the second of the Lord of the Rings movies, that kind of stuff. There's a big problem here, though. One of the sort of common issues in antiquity is people fought with shields. And not that many people, particularly in non-Roman armies, would have much body armour. That would be your body armour, would be your shield. More wealthier warriors would have body armour. Even so, the shield was really important. And of course, you tend to hold your shield in your left hand. People, generally speaking, fought with an offensive weapon in the right hand. It means this side is vulnerable to projectile weapons like arrows and javelins. So if you look at this here, and you can see that the people who are building the ramp are very vulnerable to what we would call fire, but it wasn't literally fire, there were no firearms this time, from that tower. Catapults, javelins, sling stones, just Mark I rocks. That's a real threat to them. So what the Sassanians decide to do is to do something about that tower. They start undermining it. They dig a tunnel under it, pick props, fill it with brushwood, make some air holes, set fire to it, crash, it comes down. Okay, so that's what they're starting to do. They continue building their ramp, and the Romans had a standard countermeasure at the time, which is you build your wall up. So as the ramp goes up, your wall goes up like this, and if you get unlucky, one or the other falls over. So here's the situation where the ramp is about to be finished, and the Sassanians know that when they mount their assault, they're going to have real trouble with this tower, so that's the moment they're going to fire their mine. So the Romans don't know, probably, that the Sassanians are undermining their tower, but the Sassanians don't know that the Romans are undermining the ramp. Okay? So both fire their mines, and it's kind of a bloodstained draw at half time, so to speak, in soccer terms. The ramp fails, and as far as we know, neither side is able to succeed at that point. Now, I haven't got time to go into the details of the fighting around the Palmyrean Gate, which my French colleagues excavated about 20 years ago, except to say they found evidence of a ferocious fight here. Shield bosses, fragments of iron plate, probably from siege engines, lots of burning. And what still amazed me, even my last visit to Dura, you could walk across the plateau outside the city here, you could bend down and pick up a projectile in an iron catapult bolt head, which has been lying there since the 3rd century AD. It's just an incredible place. Anyway, the main event, they didn't break through the Palmyrean Gate either, but the main thing I want to talk to you about is the remarkable finds in and around Tower 19 here, north of the Palmyrean Gate. And at this point, we can infer in some detail what the Sassanians were trying to do because of the shape of the mine they constructed. Here's Dumeniel's drawings from his publication. This one's actually 1944. He published bits of this in several different places over a period of years, which made it quite hard to reconstruct exactly what he found. But anyway, he was clearly right that what the Sassanians were trying to do here, they tried to go over the wall with the ramp, they tried to go through the gate, here they're trying to go through the wall. The idea here is to undermine and bring down a stretch of the city wall. Actually, in terms of height and width, it's not dissimilar to this wall here behind me, okay? That kind of scale, maybe a bit longer. So the idea is you undermine that, and when you fire the pick props, it should roll out into the plain and create a big breach, so a column of soldiers can charge from the Sassanian camp straight into the city. That's the idea. But remember, this side is vulnerable. You want to knock out a tower at the same time, so the next tower, they're shooting at your vulnerable sides a long way away. So the idea is you aim your mine at the tower and then take out a stretch of wall next to it. That's what they're trying to do. Okay? The one thing Dumeniel didn't work out, apparently, is where this mine had come from. And this is something that I did some work on one year when I was supposed to be working on the military base, but I couldn't resist doing this bit. Looking at air photographs of the site, there's a rather bizarre mound out here, which is right next to the open entrance to a series of tombs. The graves here are mostly loculus tombs. You punch through the surface of the plateau here, and you dig out in all directions in the soft deposits underneath. And it looks as though what the Sassanians did was they opened one of these mine grave mouths and then dug a tunnel straight under this tower and extended it along in that direction like that. And this is the spoil, because the earth had to go somewhere. They couldn't hide this, so basically it was soil coming out. The Romans knew this mining operation was coming. And the other way, incidentally, whoops, there's me standing on this spoil tip with Tower 19 in the background, and my interest mine is down The other way in antiquity you could detect mining is you literally put your ear to the ground. You could hear the miners. So the Romans worked out very accurately what the Sassanians were trying to do, and they dug a counter-mine through their own rampart to intercept the Sassanian mine. This is it. So here's their rampart. That's the flat ground inside the town here. Here's the sloping rampart up here to the wall. So they dug this tunnel to intercept the Sassanian mine gallery. And I think all they were trying to do here, all they needed to do here, was to just capture and hold it, and then they could stop the Sassanians bringing the wall down. But it all went wrong. Let me just go back briefly to that last slide. What Dumaniel found was some of the most dramatic archaeology of war that's ever been found. Because inside the countermine, he found a great tangle of bodies and military equipment, still in situ. Guys who died pretty much, or lain pretty much where they were killed in battle back in the mid-3rd century AD. Amazingly, given all the wars we know about in the Roman world, we very, very rarely find the dead of battle. And normally the bodies are disposed of, or if they're just left on the surface, they vanish. They just erode completely away. Even with a major battle, where you have literally piles of bodies, as described in antiquity, the only physical trace today might be a raised phosphate signal in the soil, and you'll never be quite sure actually whether that's just because somebody put some cattle there for a while, whether it's a pile of ancient dead. Here we've got the bodies, we've got the soldiers themselves. And this is a reconstruction that was published in the book some years ago, which nicely encapsulates Dumaniel's interpretation of what he found. Because he found a single body lying here, this guy, apparently moved here, but that's what he found. And near that body, he found a great tangle of what he interpreted as dead Romans. And what he thought had happened was, the reason there were all these dead Romans in the mine is the Romans broke into the Sassanian gallery. They then started to lose the fight underground, were retreating into their own gallery, and the Roman commander of this detachment, according to Dumaniel, panicked, feared that Sassanians was actually going to follow the Romans through into the city, thereby being a bit of an own goal, that would be, wouldn't it? To dig a mine to stop the Sassanians, that they used your mine to get into town. So what Dumaniel argued was that the commander of the Roman defenders said, right, we're going to sacrifice these guys, collapse the mouth of the mine on his own guys, trapping 20 of them in there, where they stood at bay, all shoulder to shoulder like this in a very small space, while the Sassanians then proceeded to destroy the Roman gallery by burning it to stop the Romans interfering anymore so they could continue with their mining operation. I never really thought this was very feasible. I mean, look at this. You've got these guys standing at bay, waiting to be asphyxiated or incinerated. Doesn't seem very plausible. Anyway, we'll come back to that. Those guys wind up dead. The Roman mine is collapsed, and the Romans' attempt to thwart the Sassanians has itself been thwarted. The Sassanians are able to continue with their mining operation. They undermine the stretcher wall, they fire their pit props, and it fails. All that happens, instead of it falling over into the plain, it comes unzipped at each end and sinks a metre into the ground and stays upright, as it still is today. Failed. So all those poor guys who died in the mine died in vain, because the Romans' earth rampart did its job anyway. You could have just said, no, see if you can undermine this. So it failed. But this was, of course, a catastrophe for the Romans, but it gave me a PhD, because Tower 19, the floors inside it formed rooms which were full of military equipment. And as you can see, the damage to the tower, the floors all collapsed one on top of the other. Constantine lived down. And inside these rooms were preserved the most amazing stuff that was found at Dura, including the only one of these famous half-cylinder shields we've ever found from the Roman Empire. There's a couple of fragmentary ones from Dura too. But this was still got, this is the original Roman paintwork on it, with a lion there, which might be the badge of Legion 3 Kyrenaica, we're not sure. That beautiful eagle on a globe with a couple of victories. This is astonishing stuff. And 2 complete horse arms, which were in such good condition, they took them out of the ground and put them on ponies to photograph. This is after 16 centuries in the ground. They put them on the back of a sweaty Arab pony. See, modern conservators fainted away at the sight of photographs of doing that. So amazing stuff was preserved there. That's why I say this is the remarkable archaeology of ancient warfare. So, I mean, I published all this stuff 10 years ago now, all the stuff about the military equipment, as one of the volumes of final reports of the Dura work. But I've always gone back to what actually happened in the mine. How did these guys end up where they were? Was Dumaniel right? So over the last few years, I've sort of been toying with the records that Dumaniel left, because this is in the 1930s. By modern standards, the records weren't that good, and they were published in a higgledy-piggledy, fragmentary way, which were very hard to make sense of. And that drawing on the right is the only drawing Dumaniel ever published of the whole of the mine gallery. And it's literally that big, this drawing. Tiny, tiny little pen drawing. So vastly blown up here. He did also publish a series of other drawings of parts of the mine, at higher resolution, but it was never very obvious how these drawings related to each other. Part of the reason for this was not really Dumaniel's fault, because when this stuff was all being published, this was at the beginning of World War II, and this, of course, was being published in the United States, and he was trapped in Vichy, France, after the Nazi invasion of France. So there was no communication. They couldn't say, "Can you just check your proofs like with these? Or can you explain how these drawings relate?" They published them in a higgledy-piggledy manner. But anyway, studying them closely, I was able to start making connections between them, correspondences, which, to cut a long story sideways, and this was very great fun to do this, puzzling this thing out. This again is kind of the CSI stuff, going back through the evidence files. I was able to build up something I'm very confident is an accurate, detailed plan of what Dumaniel actually found in the mine. So what I did was colour up the drawing, and I'll show it in two halves so that you can see it in more detail. So this long gallery then, and what we're talking about, the mine, is roughly about the length from this wall to the door, maybe a bit longer, I think, a bit excavated. And you could have touched it with both hands, about that wide, and I'd have to bend down a bit like that. Gives you an idea of the volume we're talking about. It's not much. So you can see this long gallery. Here's the inside of the city wall. The Sassanians are this way. So imagine that this is cut through this wedge-shaped, or Toblerone-shaped rampart, which is dipping away down and actually ends a bit of a distance up that way. So two halves. The nearer half is under what's called Wall Street. The further half is under some buildings. The half under Wall Street was found, as you can see here in this blow-up, was found chock full of rocks. The pit props were all still in place, but inside that is packed full of stones, which had actually been mortared together, which is quite an intriguing point. And underneath them, one little detail we'll come back to, on the floor of the mine, under those stones, Dumaniel found a couple of iron bodkin points, projectile point, weapon points. And we'll come back to that little detail later. Those are a bit mysterious. So what we'll do is we'll look at the mine in detail, articulating around this single body, still in armour, in the middle here, so you can see how the two halves relate together. So here he is, and so this is iron mail, so-called ring armour, and Dumaniel thought this guy was a Sassanian, which would be the first ancient Sassanian warrior and ancient Sassanian armour we've ever found. And I'm convinced he's right, he was right. This is a mail shirt, and it's got a trident device and copper rings on here, which is very much like the kind of simple geometric clan badges or tangas the Sassanians went in for. And you can see the centre of the fire which destroyed the Roman mine was near where his feet would have been, but his legs frankly burned away. Beyond the centre of the fire, you can see up there, there's a helmet and a sword. And the sword had a flat jade pommel from Chinese Turkestan, not Roman. This is pretty certainly a Sassanian sword. And the helmet, I've always been intrigued by this tiny drawing. And when I went as a graduate student to Yale in 1981, found the helmet in the stores there, never been published. I got tremendously excited about this because this is the first Sassanian helmet we've ever found. It's dated, and also its design is very, very interesting. You can see it's made of, I've coloured up the different components here, two half shells, a ridge strip binding them together, and notice this sort of Norman or medieval looking T-shaped nasal and eyebrow arrangement. Now, one of the reasons I got tremendously excited about that is not only is it an astonishing, first example of a Sassanian helmet that anybody had ever found or identified and dated, it's utterly unlike Roman helmets at the time. This is the kind of thing Roman soldiers of Dura were wearing, completely different. Big cheek pieces, one single piece neck guard helmet. However, very strangely, about 30-40 years after the siege of Dura, the Romans suddenly abandoned helmets like that and they start wearing helmets like that. which, as you can see, is made in two halves, the ridge piece and the T-shaped nails, and all that. This is a Sassanian-inspired Roman helmet. The Romans are copying Sassanian helmets in the 4th century. So that's one of the intriguing spin-offs that the mine finds. But enough of that, let's get back to the action here. So this is the centre of where the Sassanians made their fire. And the other two very important details that Dumaniel identified were accelerants that the Sassanians had used to make this fire incredibly intense very quickly. And basically they had a big jar full of crude oil, which they broke on the floor, and they also had yellow crystals, which were identified positively at the American University of Beirut as sulphur. Now, these two things together are really good for getting a fire going quickly. Okay? We'll come back to that too in a minute. What about the tangle of bodies? What's going on here? Because there was some dispute about whether these were Romans, or Clark Hopkins, one of the senior excavators at Yale, later thought, well, maybe they were Sassanians after all. Well, they certainly were Romans, because in among the bodies you can see, for example, there's a stack of Roman coins, still in the purse, effectively. The soldier had on his belt when he died in the mine. And also, I was able to identify lots of the items of military equipment in the tangle of bodies, still at Yale. And these are all standard Roman shield designs, shield bosses, and a rather fancy Roman-shaped rock crystal sword pommel. This is a showy piece, but it's a Roman type, and a Roman sword, a long sword of Sparta at the time. And these guys are wearing standard Roman male shirts, and just to prove it, it's not a terribly good picture, this is a rather old photo here, but just there, adhering to the iron mail with some iron finger rings, still with fingers inside, I'm afraid, which are, again, Roman types of fingering. So these are clearly all Roman soldiers in this stack. So what actually happened then? How did these guys end up in that tangle? Which Dumaniel thought, basically, they're all standing together like this, and they get basically asphyxiated by the smoke and flames, and they just collapse. Well, it was possible to work out the order of the three drawings Dumaniel left us with, and to work out, he actually effectively dug this in 3 layers. So in chronological order, here's how these bodies came to be where they were found. If these guys had collapsed, because they were standing absolutely crammed shoulder to shoulder, you'd expect the bodies to be in discrete blocks, so just fallen like this. When you look in detail at what Dumaniel recorded, faithfully recorded, accurately recorded, that cannot possibly have been the case. If you look at the purple one here, number 10, you can see the pelvis is right up against the corner of the wall, the legs are stretched right across the floor. So this guy was sat right up against the wall, his legs stretched down in front of him. Likewise, the blue number 12 and the green number 6 seem to be sat up against the other side. And then you've got a body that's laying right across the middle of the stack. These bodies can't possibly have fallen like this. These guys have been placed sitting up, or maybe they sat themselves, but it's very unlikely. And then another body, 14, has been lain up against the Persian side, what I think is a growing body stack. And then we go to the middle layer. Now, a lot of the bodies were very disarticulated. The only bits you could find articulated, identified, and drawn were, as you can see here, for the most part, vertebral columns. You've got number 16, the red one there, another body laid across, a more intact body, the green one, number 15, laid right across the tunnel from one side to the other, and then more bodies laid up against this growing pile from the Persian side. And then the topmost layer, these are the ones you would have dug first, of course, the bodies are almost completely burned away because the centre of the fire is just here. These bodies were largely marked out by the fragments of armour that they'd been wearing when they were incinerated. 3 more bodies laying up against the Persian side of the stack. This is a deliberately created stack of bodies that the Sassanians had built in the middle of the mine. These guys did not die at this point, they died elsewhere. So here's what I think actually happened. So the Sassanians turn up, they start attacking the city, and they target this particular point for assault. They dig an approach mine underneath the hard gypsum capping of the city, and then they dig upwards through this rock hard stuff. It breaks bulldozers, this stuff today. It's amazingly tough. They managed to punch upwards and start undermining the tower and the adjacent stretch of the city wall. As we saw, the Romans knew they were coming. They dig a countermine through their own rampart to attack the Sassanians on this critical level here. And then the Romans, as they're about to break through, form an assault party, fill the mine with, well, probably 30 soldiers, I suspect, but 20 of them never made it out. And they break through into the Persian gallery, okay? There we go. Very quickly, this is what we'll come back to, somehow 20 of them end up dead in the mine. And the Sassanians take control of the Roman gallery. And I think what they found there, the space really requires this, that they found the whole of the floor covered with Roman dead. Which of course was actually a real problem for them, because what they wanted to do was get to the middle of the Roman tunnel, away from their own mine workings, which they wanted to leave intact. They wanted to bring down the middle of the Roman tunnel, so they needed to clear the floor to build the fire simply so they could move around in there. But I think also they had other reasons for needing the Roman bodies. Because what they were going to be very worried about was the Romans trying to get back into the mine and have another go. They needed to block the mine quickly. And basically they used the Roman dead to build a wall. And they had a further reason for doing this, because you remember that I mentioned that there were catapult bolts on the floor of the mine, somewhere about there. A known technique, which is recorded in Roman accounts, if you have a gallery, an enemy mine gallery which is in their control, if you're not going to send your troops into it for now, you can give them a hard time by shooting down it with catapult bolts. And it's exactly what the Romans did. Having lost control of their tunnel, they set up a light arrow shooter and were shooting into the smoky dark here to try to discourage the Sassanians. So the Sassanians were using the Roman dead as literally organic sandbags, which is what in the British Army this is slang for close protection bodyguards. They're known as organic sandbags. Here, literally, that's what they are. So then the Sassanians set their fire. And the way they do this, as we saw, is with a jar of crude oil, they've got sulphur. There were remains found of bunches of wood, fine wood they brought in. And there are also some Roman cloak brooches and shield bosses at this point. They've got a couple of Roman shields, they've got some cloaks, lots of combustibles, whoosh, up it goes. Which also, I think, helps to explain the lone Sassanian here. He is the guy who set the fire, but he didn't get out. He may already have been injured, he may have been shot by the Romans, he may have guessed, I'm dying, guys, I'm finished, I'll set the fire and get out of here. Or it may simply be a little more likely, is he simply stayed too long, he was overcome by the poisonous fumes of the crude oil and the sulphur he was using to set the fire. He just didn't make it out. Then the roof of the mine comes in, and the reason his body wasn't recovered was it was hidden from the Sassanians, they couldn't see it, because of the roof having come in over the top of it. And they then got the still intact part of the Roman mine gallery here, which the Sassanians then use to fill. They were still producing lots of rock from here. They use this as a convenient place to dump the rock, giving them to carry all the way down here and out their tunnel. They can use it, put it in there, and they mortar it together to stop the Romans coming back in again if the Romans decide to have another go at tunnelling. And then they fire their mine, and it fails, as we saw earlier on. So that's what I think happened. So these bodies were brought to this point because they were already dead or incapacitated. They were used as a wall to stop the Romans coming back into the mine. But this, of course, now creates an additional problem. Neil thought the reason they were there was because they died there. I'm arguing that they died somewhere else. They died along the floor of the mine here. How did they die? Is the problem. It might be that the Sassanians were phenomenally good at siege mine fighting, and that they actually died in hand-to-hand combat. Like, that's really, really unlikely. The space is too tiny. I came up with one or two other possible ideas. The best candidate I could come up with myself was a crowd crush incident, because of course we've had a number of things like this happen in Europe, a football stadia in tunnels and things where lots of people in a confined space have just got crushed and asphyxiated. You can imagine that happening in a tiny dark space, this high, that wide, full of keyed up soldiers trying to get into the space, and people at the front are being pushed back, people at the back are pushing forwards, and people get crushed in the middle. That's feasible, I think, but then one of my ancient historian colleagues said smoke, and I immediately twigged that there was a really horrible way of producing smoke in this mine. So here's what I think actually happened. So we saw how the Romans heard the Sassanians mining, they started digging a counter mine. The Sassanians could hear the Romans coming by the same token, they could hear the Roman miners coming. So they prepared a little surprise for them. Because the Sassanians, I think, knew about a Greek siege technique, a stratagem for giving people in a mine a really hard time if you wanted to get them out. So here come the Romans break through, and the nasty surprise the Sassanians have created for them is a smoke generator. I think down in their own tunnel, most likely. It's the obvious place for it. Because the moment that the two tunnels are connected, you've got an air current through here, you've got a natural chimney at this point, and also, incidentally, the prevailing wind would blow this way. There'd be a massive airflow through here. So it may be they wouldn't have needed the blacksmith bellows I suggested here. But they could have had this brazier full of hot charcoal ready. That in itself may well have been enough to force the Romans out of the mine. Just hot gases, lack of oxygen, they would have had to get out or suffocate. But I think there was a nasty twist to this, because you remember we know the Sassanians had crude oil to hand and sulphur crystals. So what I proposed is that they had already used these a few minutes earlier. They poured the crude oil and thrown the sulphur crystals onto this brazier. Now, of course, what that would then do is to produce dense petrochemical smoke, which would be sucked or blown up into the Roman gallery. In an already dark environment, suddenly you've enveloped in pitch blackness. But it's the sulphur crystals which are the real horror, because what they would do would be to produce sulphur dioxide gas, which when it comes into contact with your eyes and your mucous membranes turns into sulfurous acid, which, as you can imagine, is just horrific. So these guys, the guys at the front, would be suddenly enveloped in these clouds before the guys at the back had the remotest idea what was happening. And I think only a few of the guys at the back would have been able to turn around and stagger choking out of the tunnel. So all the Sassanians then had to do, essentially, was to keep their generator going until the noises in the tunnel above stopped, and they then douse it, just wait a couple of minutes for the wind to blow the smoke through. Meanwhile, some of the survivors will stagger back out, and the Romans are going to hesitate because they literally have the fumes of hell pouring out of this mine, and a lot of their guys have not come out. They're going to be wondering, what the hell was that? This gives the Sassanians time to get in, stack the bodies, make the wall, and get their fire going. So that's what I think actually happened on this site. Now, the device I've just described to you, this is hypothetical, but I can't think of a better way of explaining all these dead. It was a known ancient stratagem. The Romans, the Greeks used this against the Romans in the 2nd century BC. They only used burning feathers, but that would have been nasty enough. So it's kind of the stratagem that would have been in the handbooks of siege warfare of the period. And what the Sassanians show at Dura is that they had mastered all of the other tricks of ancient siege warfare. Ramps, mines, artillery, big siege camps, all of these things, they know how to do it. I think there's no reason at all to suspect that they would not have known about the idea of smoke generators too. If you used a weapon like that in circumstances like this in the modern world, that would rank under modern conventions about chemical warfare as a chemical weapon. This is something that's designed to generate poisonous smoke with intent to, in this case, I think there's no doubt, to kill enemy soldiers. This actually is, I think, I don't even think we really need to put a quote mark around this. You could call this chemical warfare in antiquity. I was big in Tehran for a while, once after I published this idea, once it became publicly known. And I was accused of spreading black propaganda against the Islamic Republic, which of course isn't true. But also this was seized upon by various right-wing bloggers in this country as evidence that Iranians have always been nasty people. So I found myself caught in a propaganda war for a while after this. But nonetheless, I was sticking to my guns, so to speak, and saying this really is an ancient example of chemical warfare. However, I would say I can't prove this. It's a circumstantial argument, but I think the gun is smoking quite a lot, so to speak. The other point which I should remember to mention, because somebody will ask otherwise, is where are the bodies now? Could we study them? And the answer is, I'm afraid, although we got the arms and armour from the mine, we do not know where the bones are, except for a few bones which are inside the armour still at Yale. My own suspicion is that Dumesnil, who was himself a veteran of the First World War, he would have realised, well, this is a war grave. I think that he will have reinterred the bodies in the mine, which seems to have been backfilled, having visited the site on a number of occasions, looked closely at this. So I think those soldiers are still there, still in that mine, if ever we get the chance to get back into Dura. I hesitate about disturbing the war grave again. There's no way I think you could tell from the bones whether this hypothesis of chemical warfare was true or not, because anyway these bodies were exposed to sulfur and petrochemicals immediately after this through the firing of the mine. However, there might be other good reasons for trying to look at these bodies, because it may be that we could do things like isotope analysis on teeth, which might be able to tell us where these soldiers came from, which itself would be very interesting. Whether they were the Roman garrison of the city or whether they were European expeditionary troops put into the city, which is also a possibility. So there are research questions we might still ask of these poor dead bodies, if we could ever get back to find them again. Just to kind of finish the story off, we've seen that the Sassanians failed, as far as we can see, to break in at the siege ramp or at the gate, or indeed Tower 19. And it's long been wondered whether maybe eventually the city just surrendered on terms. Or did it actually fall? Was there fighting through the streets? And this is where I got very lucky during the course of excavation when I wasn't looking for this at all. Because the Roman military base, which was the main subject of my work recently, has this wall defining it from the civil city, which seemed to stop halfway across the street here. This was as far as our American and French forerunners got in 1937, and the question was, did that wall go on? So I did a small excavation there with a small team of local Arab workmen to try to see if the wall went on, and it kind of pieces out literally to nothing across the street. So we don't know whether it went on or not, it just doesn't survive anymore. But in the course of this little dig, I was astonished to discover in the corner between, this is the street wall here, this is the street, the wall of the buildings adjacent to it, here's where the camp wall comes across the road. In this corner here, I found what looked for all the world like a row of machine gun bullets, like a belt of machine gun ammunition. It isn't actually. These are heads of a row of wooden shafted catapult bolts from a light arrow shooter, like that, the Roman equivalent of a light machine gun, which have been set up evidently on the wall, the perimeter wall of the base area of the Roman soldiers, to shoot down this road. This is evidence of the soldiers preparing for the last stand in their own camp, inside the city as it was falling. That's clearly what this is about, and that ammunition got left there, which I think itself is a graphic point. It was not collected up afterwards. And so that's a piece of new archaeology, but again, coming back finally to the archival work, one of the blocks of housing inside the military base, which is turned into Roman barracks, was excavated by Frank Brown, never published, but we got his records still at Yale, including his notebooks, and these reveal a couple of unpublished gruesome details. So in that room, you have got this body lying on the floor, an intact body. It says here, fragments of male cuirass. So this guy's in armour, he's a soldier, lying on the floor in one of these barrack rooms. And at the other end of the block, there's this character, a poor person here, a skeleton of youth or girl with skull stove in, mouth open wide. In fact, actually, that's probably a result of post-burial decay. But what struck me as fascinating is, of course, you do not bury people in rooms in antiquity. These are people who've been killed, they're lying on the floor, and one of them is a soldier at least, the other one perhaps is a soldier's family member. The other detail we can infer from this is the roofs came in on these bodies very quickly, because there are still jackals today at Dura. There are sheep inside the city. If a sheep dies, it's dismembered within a few days by the jackals. These bodies were not accessible to be predated upon after the city was abandoned straight after this. The roofs are coming. So you've got slaughter through the streets, destruction of the garrison buildings. We don't know whether there are any survivors of the sack of the city of Dura. What is evident is that if there had been any survivors, Shapur did here what he did at a number of other cities in Syria, which is to take everybody away. He went in for biblical-style deportations of entire city populations, taking them back into the Sassanian Empire. And he deliberately left Dura a derelict ruin, which thereafter was depopulated. And our last glimpse of the city is a century later, when one of my favourite emperors, the last pagan emperor of Rome, Julian, about whom Gorvidal wrote a brilliant novel, he came through this way on his ill-fated last expedition, was yet another Roman emperor trying to conquer Iraq. Bad move. He dies a short while after this, but he has in his entourage my favourite late Roman historian, Ammianus Marcellinus, who by coincidence had recently himself survived another siege, very much like Dura, for which we only have a textual account. It makes a wonderful contrast in comparison. But he comes through here with the Roman army, And this is what he records. After marching for 2 days from Circesium, we approached the deserted city of Dura. Here we found several herds of deer through the streets of the city. Thereafter, the city's abandoned to the winds, effectively, and even its name is forgotten until it's discovered in 1920 by those British Indian troops, and it's revealed once more to history and to the administrations of generations of archaeologists who are able to tell you stories like this on the basis of those remains buried in that terrible siege around AD 256. Thank you very much.